The rain came sideways off the Bristol Channel the morning they read the will, and Eleanor Pryce stood at the back of the drawing room where the staff were meant to stand, holding a tray she had forgotten she was holding. She had polished that tray only 2 hours earlier, before she'd understood there would be no more mornings of polishing anything in this house. Force of habit had put it in her hands. Force of habit had made her wear her gray uniform, the one with the small ink stain on the left cuff that no amount of scrubbing had ever lifted. 22 years of habit did not evaporate simply because the man she had served was in the ground. The Ashworth family had arranged themselves across the front of the room like a portrait that had been painted to exclude her. Julian Ashworth, the eldest son, sat with one ankle crossed over his knee and his phone face down on his thigh, tapping it every few seconds as though it might resurrect itself into something more interesting than his own father's estate. Beside him, his wife Camilla wore black that had clearly been bought new for the occasion, the tag creases still faintly visible at the shoulders. Then Petra, the daughter, 41 and furious in a way she'd been furious since childhood, her mouth a thin line drawn with a ruler. And at the end, slightly apart, Dominic, the youngest, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, though Eleanor had learned long ago that Dominic's discomfort never once translated into action. The solicitor was a small, precise man named Mr. Hargreave, of Hargreave, Nash and Pointer, Queen Square, Bristol, and he had the particular calm of a man who had watched a great many families discover exactly how much they had misjudged one another. "Thank you all for coming," he said, though of course they had not come out of grief. They had come because Sir Rowland Ashworth had died possessed of a fortune estimated, in the more conservative newspapers, at £340 million, and in the less conservative ones at rather more. Eleanor set the tray down on the sideboard, very quietly, and folded her hands. She had loved the old man. That was the thing none of them knew, or if they suspected it, they framed it in the ugliest possible way. The way Petra had once framed it at a Christmas dinner 11 years ago when she'd had too much wine and said, loudly enough for the whole table, "We all know why Daddy keeps her around." Eleanor had carried the pudding in at that exact moment and had set it down without so much as a tremor in her hands, and Sir Rowland had gone very still and very cold and said, "Petra, you will apologize to Mrs. Pryce or you will leave my house." And Petra had not apologized, and Petra had left, and had not spoken to her father for the better part of a year. It had not been like that. It had never once been like that. But the truth of what it had been was hers alone now, and she intended to keep it. Mr. Hargreave opened a leather folder. "I'll read the operative clauses," he said, "and we can address questions afterward." Sir Rowland was, as many of you know, a precise man, and his instructions were precise. Julian tapped his phone. "The bulk of the residuary estate," Mr. Hargreave began, "including Cranmore House and its grounds, the London property in Cadogan Gardens, the entirety of Sir Rowland's shareholding in Ashworth Meridian Holdings, the art collection, and all associated liquid assets." Here Julian looked up finally, and something almost like hunger passed over his face. "Is left in its entirety," Mr. Hargreave continued, "to Mrs. Eleanor Margaret Pryce, presently of the staff quarters, Cranmore House." The silence that followed was not silence. It was the sound a room makes when 4 people stop breathing at once. Eleanor did not move. She was aware of her own heartbeat, slow and heavy, and of the rain against the tall windows, and of the small ink stain on her cuff. She was aware, most of all, that she had not misheard, because Mr. Hargreave was looking directly at her now over the top of his spectacles, with an expression she could not read. "That's not possible," said Petra. "I assure you it is entirely possible, Miss Ashworth." "That's," Julian had stood up without deciding to, "that's insane." "That's she's a cleaner." "Mrs. Pryce is described in the will as the estate's housekeeper," said Mr. Hargreave mildly, "though I'll note the document itself uses a rather more expansive term." "I don't care what term it uses," Julian's voice had climbed. "My father left £300 million to the help, to her. That will is a forgery, or he was. He wasn't in his right mind, he was 91, he had. There were episodes, everyone knows there were episodes." Sir Rowland was assessed by 2 independent physicians in the 6 months preceding the execution of this will, Mr. Hargreaves said, specifically, and I quote his own instruction, "so that no one of my children may claim I did not know precisely what I was doing." Camilla had begun, very softly, to cry, though whether from grief or arithmetic was unclear. And through all of it, Eleanor Pryce stood at the back of the room, by the sideboard, next to the tray she had polished that morning, and said nothing at all. Because there was nothing she could say that would not make it worse, and because this was the part she could admit to no one, she was not entirely surprised. That was the thing that would haunt the Ashworths in the weeks and months to come, once they had time to replay this moment. That the woman they had regarded as furniture for 22 years had received the news of her sudden, staggering fortune with the composure of someone who had, in some private compartment of herself, been expecting it. They descended on her within the hour. Julian first, cornering her in the corridor outside the drawing-room, while the others were still arguing with Mr. Hargreaves. He was 53, but he had his father's height and none of his father's stillness, and he used the height now, standing too close, the way men do when they want a woman to feel the size of them. "Whatever you did," he said quietly, "however you got to him, we will unpick it. Do you understand me? You'll be in court for the rest of your natural life. You won't see a penny of it. You'll spend everything you don't have on lawyers, and you'll lose, and at the end you'll be exactly what you always were, a skivvy in someone else's house." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Your father," she said, "used to call you the clever one. Did you know that?" Julian blinked. "He said it sadly," Eleanor went on, in the same even tone she had used to announce dinner for 2 decades. "Because you were clever, and you never once did anything with it except find reasons things couldn't be done. He said a clever man who only sees obstacles is more useless than a stupid man who tries." She picked up the tray. "Old habit. Excuse me. There are people who'll want tea." She left him standing in the corridor, and she felt his eyes on her back the entire length of it, and she did not hurry. That night she did not sleep in the staff quarters. She could not have said why. She lay awake on the narrow bed that had been hers since 2003, in the small room over the old scullery with its one window looking out at the kitchen garden, and she listened to the house settle and tick around her. This house that was hers now, apparently, all of it, the 41 rooms and the twin staircases and the ballroom no one had danced in since the coronation, and she felt no ownership at all. She felt like a trespasser who had been handed the keys. At some point after 2 she got up, put on her dressing gown, and went down through the sleeping house to the library. Sir Rowland's library, where it had begun, really, all of it, though it was not what any of the Ashworths imagined. She had first come to Cranmore in the spring of 2003, 31 years old, with a reference from an agency and a past she did not discuss. She had been hired as a housemaid. Within a year she was head of the household staff. Within 3 she was, in every way that mattered, the person who ran Cranmore House, who managed its staff and its accounts and its endless small crises, who knew which of the 12 chimneys smoked and which floorboards betrayed a footstep, and which of the temporary gardeners could be trusted with the roses. And along the way, without either of them ever naming it, she had become the person Sir Rowland Ashworth talked to. Not his confidant, nothing so intimate as that word suggested. But he was a widower, and his children were the kind of children who telephone when they wanted something, and the house was very large and very quiet in the evenings, and Eleanor was there. She would bring him his supper in the library, where he took it more and more often as he aged, and she would set it down and turn to go, and some evenings he would say, "Sit a moment, Mrs. Pryce. Tell me what you make of this," and he would hand her a letter or a contract or a page of figures from Meridian Holdings, and he would watch her read it. He had discovered, quite by accident, in her second year, that Eleanor Pryce read a balance sheet the way most people read a headline. That she could look at a column of numbers and see the story in it, the lie hiding in the story, the small, persistent wrongness that meant someone somewhere was taking what wasn't theirs. "Where did you learn to read accounts?" he had asked her that first evening, genuinely startled. And she had said, "Here and there, sir," and had taken his supper tray away, and he had not pressed, because he was a man who understood that everyone was entitled to a locked room somewhere inside themselves. But he had never forgotten it, and over the years that followed he had, quietly, without ever once putting it in writing or acknowledging it aloud in the presence of another living soul, come to rely on Eleanor Pryce's eyes. She stood now in the dark library among the books, and she thought about the last conversation they had had 4 days before he died, when he had gripped her wrist with a strength that had frightened her and said, "It's in the house, Eleanor, when you need it. You'll know where to look. I'm sorry to leave it to you. I'm sorry to leave all of it to you, but you're the only one I could trust not to burn it down." She had thought he was rambling. The doctors had said there would be rambling toward the end. She was no longer sure he had been rambling at all. The first solicitor's letter arrived 9 days later, on behalf of Julian Ashworth, contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and testamentary incapacity. The second, 2 days after that, on behalf of Petra, alleged substantially the same and added, for flavor, an accusation that Mrs. Pryce had systematically isolated the deceased from his family. Eleanor read them both at the long kitchen table, with a pot of tea going cold at her elbow, and then she telephoned Mr. Hargreave. "I expected as much," he said. "I'll be frank with you, Mrs. Pryce. These actions rarely succeed when the testator has taken the precautions Sir Rowland took. He was extraordinarily careful, almost as though he anticipated exactly this." "He did anticipate it," Eleanor said. "He told me he did." "Then I imagine you'll want to instruct me to defend the estate." Eleanor turned the letter over in her hands. "Mr. Hargreave," she said slowly, "may I ask you something? In your professional judgment, did Sir Rowland ever discuss with you why he did this? Not the legal formalities, the reason." There was a pause on the line. "He said something to me," Hargreave admitted, "which I did not fully understand at the time and which I'll pass to you now for whatever you can make of it." He said, "I'm not leaving it to her because I trust her more than my children, though I do. I'm leaving it to her because she is the only one who will know what to do when they come." A pause. "I asked him when who comes, and he said," Hargreave cleared his throat, "the ones who have been waiting for me to die." Eleanor sat very still. "He didn't mean his children," she said. "No," said Mr. Hargreave. "I don't believe he did." Ashworth Meridian Holdings occupied 11 floors of a glass tower on Victoria Street in Bristol, and Eleanor Pryce had never once set foot in it. She went on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral, in a plain navy coat that had cost £40 in a sale, and she stood in the marble lobby and looked up at the atrium and understood, with a cold clarity, why Sir Rowland had spent his last years growing quieter and quieter about the company that bore his name. Because it was too big. It had grown too big for one old man in a library to hold in his head, and somewhere in its 11 floors of glass, something had gone wrong, and he had known it, and he had not been able to prove it, and he had run out of time. "It's in the house, Eleanor, when you need it." She gave her name at the desk. The receptionist, a young man with a lanyard, typed it in and frowned. "I'm sorry, I don't. Are you a shareholder?" "I own it," Eleanor said without emphasis. "Or I will once probate clears. In the meantime, I'm the executor's principal. I'd like to see Mr. Callow, please." Marcus Callow was the chief executive of Ashworth Meridian, a role he had held for 6 years, a broad, handsome man of 50 with silver hair and a tailor's understanding of how to dress a body to suggest trustworthiness. He came down himself, which surprised her, and he shook her hand warmly, which surprised her more, and he said, "Mrs. Pryce, of course. Roland spoke of you often. Please come up. We should talk." His office was on the 11th floor, and its windows looked out over the whole gray sweep of the city to the channel beyond. "I won't pretend," Callow said, pouring coffee she hadn't asked for, "that the situation isn't awkward. The family are briefing the press. There's a rather unpleasant piece in the Post this morning. But I want you to know, Mrs. Pryce, that as far as this company is concerned, Roland's wishes are sacred. He built this. If he wanted you to have it, then you shall have it, and you'll have my full cooperation." He smiled. "Though I gently suggest that the day-to-day of a business this size is rather a lot for anyone to absorb. My advice, for what it's worth, is to let the professionals continue running things while the legal dust settles. You needn't trouble yourself with any of it. You needn't trouble yourself with any of it." She had heard that sentence, or its cousins, 10,000 times in 22 years. "Don't you worry about that, love. Leave it with us. It's rather complicated." It was the sentence people used when they wanted a woman to look somewhere other than where they were standing. "That's very kind," Eleanor said. "I'm sure you're right. I know nothing about business." She sipped the coffee. It was excellent coffee. "I wonder, Mr. Callow, while I'm here, might I trouble you for the management accounts? The last 3 years, just to have something to show the solicitors. I understand very little of it, but they do ask." Callow's smile did not change, but something behind it did. A very small recalibration, the kind Eleanor had spent a lifetime learning to catch. "Of course," he said. "I'll have finance put together a summary for you. A nice clear overview, much easier than wading through the raw figures." "Oh, I shouldn't want to make work for anyone," Eleanor said. "The raw figures would be quite sufficient, whatever you'd give the auditors. I'll only be handing them straight to Mr. Hargreave." The pause was almost nothing, a quarter of a second. "Naturally," said Callow. She left the tower an hour later with a promise of documents that she suspected would arrive slowly, in the wrong format, with the wrong years, missing exactly the pages that mattered. She had watched men like Marcus Callow her whole life. She knew the choreography of a man buying himself time. And walking back across the wet plaza toward the bus stop, she had not thought to arrange a car, would not have known she was entitled to one. Eleanor Pryce did something she had not done in more than 2 decades. She let herself remember who she had been before. She had been born Eleanor Vaughan in Swansea in 1972, the daughter of a schoolteacher and an accountant, and she had been, everyone agreed, alarmingly clever. She had gone up to the London School of Economics at 18 and come down at 21 with a first in economics, and she had walked, at 22, straight into the graduate scheme of one of the city's oldest merchant banks. By 26, she was a forensic accountant, not the sort who tallied receipts. The sort that governments and liquidators and serious fraud office lawyers called when a company had collapsed and someone needed to walk backward through the wreckage and find the exact place where the honesty had ended and the theft had begun. She had a gift for it that frightened her superiors a little. She could hold a corporate structure of 40 interlocking entities in her head like a chess position and see, 3 moves back, where the money had been made to disappear. And then, at 29, she had found something she was not supposed to find. She had been seconded to examine the books of a shipping and logistics conglomerate. She had trained herself over the years since not even to think its name, and what she had found, threaded through a dozen shell companies in 3 jurisdictions, was not ordinary fraud. It was worse. It was a mechanism, elegant and patient, by which a great deal of money that belonged to pension funds, to nurses, to bus drivers, to retired teachers like her own mother, was being quietly bled into private accounts, a fraction of a % at a time, in a way designed to be invisible for decades. She had done what she was trained to do. She had documented it. She had taken it to her superior. And her superior had listened very carefully, and had thanked her, and had told her to leave the file with him. 3 weeks later, she had been called into a meeting and told that her work had contained serious methodological errors, that her conclusions were unfounded and potentially defamatory, and that the firm no longer had confidence in her judgment. There was, they explained, a document trail, emails she did not remember writing, a pattern of erratic decisions she did not remember making. It was all very regrettable. They would not be pursuing the matter formally, out of kindness, provided she went quietly. She had gone quietly, because she was 29 and terrified, and did not yet understand that quietly was exactly what they needed her to be. Within a year, her professional reputation was ash. No firm in the city would touch her. The whisper that followed her, unstable, unreliable, made wild accusations, had some sort of breakdown, was worse than any accusation because there was nothing to answer. She could not sue a whisper. She had watched, over the following 2 years, as the shipping conglomerate she had investigated grew and grew, as its chairman was knighted, as the pension money she had traced vanished so thoroughly that when the funds finally collapsed in 2002, and the pensioners lost everything, no one ever connected it to the elegant patient mechanism she had documented in a file that no longer existed. And then she had disappeared, changed her name to her grandmother's, Pryce, and taken a job cleaning houses, because it was honest and it was invisible, and no one asked a housemaid about her methodological errors. She had never meant to stay. She had meant to hide for a year, 2 years, until she found her feet. She had been hiding for 22. The documents from Ashworth Meridian arrived, as she had predicted, slowly in the wrong format, with a covering note from Marcus Callow's office explaining that a full historical reconciliation would take some weeks to prepare, and that in the meantime she was welcome to this high-level summary. The summary was 4 pages. It told her nothing. Eleanor sat at the long kitchen table at Cranmore. She still could not bring herself to use any of the grander rooms, and read the 4 pages, and then she read them again, and on the second reading she found what she had been looking for. Not information, the absence of information. There was a subsidiary listed, Meridian Coastal Logistics, that appeared in the group structure and then did not appear anywhere in the summarized figures, as though it were a room in a house that had a door but no floor. She got up, made a fresh pot of tea, and went to find where the old man had hidden what he'd known. "It's in the house, Eleanor. You'll know where to look." She had assumed at first that he meant the library. She had spent 3 fruitless evenings there. But now, standing in the middle of Cranmore House with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, she thought about the man himself, about how his mind had worked, and she understood that Sir Rowland would not have hidden something important where anyone would think to look for something important. He would have hidden it where only she would look, where only she went. She climbed the back stairs, the servants' stairs, narrow and unbeautiful, to the small room over the old scullery. Her own room, the room she had slept in for 22 years. And she stood in the doorway and looked at it with new eyes, and she saw the loose board. She had known about the loose board for years. Third from the window, it lifted slightly when you stepped on it, and she had always meant to have it fixed and never had. She knelt now and worked her fingers under the edge and lifted it, and beneath it, in the dusty cavity between the joists, wrapped in oilcloth, was a package. Inside the oilcloth was a leather document case, and inside the document case were perhaps 200 pages, in Sir Rowland's own hand and in the printouts of a man who did not trust computers, and a single sheet on top, folded once, with her name on it. She opened the folded sheet first. "Eleanor," it read. "If you're reading this, then I'm dead and you've done what I knew you'd do, which is refuse to leave things be. Good. I've known what you are since about a fortnight after you came to me, not a housekeeper. You never once fooled me, though I let you think you had, because I could see you needed the fooling more than I needed the truth. A woman doesn't read a balance sheet the way you do unless someone once paid her to. And a woman doesn't hide the way you hide unless reading a balance sheet the way you do once cost her everything. I never asked. It wasn't mine to ask. But I looked into a few things over the years quietly, the way a curious old man can. And I think I know some of what was done to you, Eleanor Vaughn. She stopped, sat down hard on the edge of the narrow bed. Read the name again in the dead man's handwriting. Eleanor Vaughn. No one had written that name in 22 years. Here is what you need to know. My company is being robbed. I've felt it for 3 years, the way you feel a draft in an old house before you find the crack. Money is going somewhere it shouldn't, and every time I get close, the paper turns to smoke in my hands. I'm too old and too tired, and I don't have your eyes. Callow tells me I'm imagining it. Callow tells me a great many things. I've put in this case everything I managed to gather before I ran out of road. It won't be enough to prove anything, but it will be enough to show you where to dig. And you, my dear, know how to dig. I couldn't leave the company to my children. Julian would sell it within a year to the first bidder and never ask why they were paying over the odds. Petra would tear it apart out of spite. Dominic would do whatever the last person to speak to him suggested. And whoever is robbing me is counting on exactly that, on my death and on my children and on the confusion. They've been waiting for me to die, Eleanor. I could feel them waiting. So I left it to the one person who won't sell, won't tear, won't be led, and won't stop until she's found the crack and every hand that widened it. I'm sorry. It's a terrible thing to leave a person. It nearly killed me and I only own it. But you're not going to inherit a fortune, Eleanor. You're going to inherit a fight. And you are the only person I ever met who I'd put money on to win it. Find them, take back what they took. Not for me. For whoever they'll rob next when I'm not here to feel the draft. R.A. P.S. Petra was wrong at that Christmas, and I hope she chokes on it. You were the best of us. You were always the best of us. Eleanor Pryce sat on the narrow bed in the small room where she had hidden for 22 years, and she wept, once briefly, with her hand pressed hard against her mouth so that the empty house would not hear. And then she wiped her face and picked up the 200 pages and began to read. It took her 4 days. She barely slept. She spread the pages across the long kitchen table and then across the kitchen floor, and then, when the kitchen was full, she surrendered at last to the grandeur of the house and moved the whole operation into the ballroom, where she laid the documents out in ranks across the parquet under the cold light of the chandeliers, and she walked among them in her slippers and her cardigan, a small gray woman moving through a great gold room, assembling a picture that Sir Roland Ashworth had spent 3 years failing to assemble, because he had lacked one thing she had in abundance. He had lacked the training to see the shape of a lie built by professionals. She had been trained to see nothing else. And what she found over those 4 sleepless days made the blood beat slow and cold in her throat, because it was not new to her. That was the thing. The mechanism she uncovered inside Ashworth Meridian, the shell companies, the subsidiary with a door but no floor. The money bled a fraction of a percent at a time through Meridian Coastal Logistics into a web of entities that dissolved across 3 jurisdictions. It was not merely similar to the thing she had found 23 years ago in the books of a shipping conglomerate, whose name she had trained herself not to think. It was the same mechanism, the same architecture, the same signature, the same hand. She sat down in the middle of the ballroom floor, surrounded by the paper ranks of a dead man's suspicion, and she understood that she had not stumbled into a new fight at all. She had been handed, 22 years late, the only thing she had ever truly wanted and never dared hope for. She had been handed the chance to finish the fight that had destroyed her. The chairman of that shipping conglomerate, the man who had been knighted while she was made into a whisper, the man whose elegant patient mechanism had cost a generation of pensioners everything. He had not died, and he had not stopped, and he had not retired. He had simply moved his mechanism, quietly, patiently into other houses, bigger houses. And one of the houses he had moved it into, God help them all, was the house that Sir Rowland Ashworth had built. She did not yet have his name in these papers. Sir Rowland had never known who was at the top of it, only that the draft was real. But Eleanor knew the signature of the hand, and she knew that if she pulled hard enough on the thread that ran through Meridian Coastal Logistics, she would eventually pull the man himself out into the light. The man she had spent 22 years hiding from. She got up off the floor, her knees ached. She was 54 years old and she had been a housemaid for most of her adult life, and she was, on paper, one of the wealthiest women in the west of England, and she stood in the great gold ballroom of a house full of ghosts, and she said, aloud to no one, in a voice that did not shake, "All right then." Just that, all right then. The rain had stopped. Somewhere beyond the tall windows the sky over the channel was beginning, very faintly, to gray toward dawn, and Eleanor Pryce, Eleanor Vaughan, began methodically to gather up the papers. She had a great deal of work to do. The offices of Hargreave, Nash and Pointer smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and Eleanor found this obscurely comforting, because it was the smell of the world she had come from, the world of small, precise men who kept records. She had come to make Mr. Hargreave understand something, and she had thought carefully about how much to tell him, and she had decided, on the long bus ride into Bristol, to tell him nearly everything. Because a lawyer who is defending you blindly is a lawyer who can be surprised, and she did not intend to be surprised again by anyone, ever. "I need to tell you who I am," she said, when the coffee had been poured and the door closed, "and I need you to keep it for now between us." Hargreave folded his hands. "I'm a solicitor, Mrs. Pryce. Keeping things is the whole of the job." So she told him, not all of it, but the shape of it, the LSC, the merchant bank, the forensic work, the shipping conglomerate, the file that had been made to vanish, the whisper that had followed her, the 22 years of hiding. She watched his face as she spoke, and to his credit it did not do the thing she had feared, the thing so many faces did, the small flinch of so there was something wrong with her after all. It did the opposite. It grew still and then grave and then at the end faintly angry. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that Sir Rowland left his entire estate to a forensic accountant who spent 2 decades in hiding, because she was destroyed for uncovering exactly the kind of fraud he believed was destroying his company?" "Yes." "And that he knew this?" "He knew most of it. He worked some of it out himself. He was cleverer than his children ever gave him credit for." Hargreave sat back. He took off his spectacles, polished them on a cloth from his waistcoat pocket, put them back on. It was, Eleanor recognized, the gesture of a man giving himself a moment to reorganize his understanding of the world. "Then the will isn't eccentric at all," he said finally. "It's the most rational document I've ever read. He didn't leave his fortune to his housekeeper. He hired the one investigator in Britain who couldn't be bought, bribed, or frightened, because she'd already lost everything there was to lose, and he paid her in advance with the whole estate." A pause. "My God, and the family are calling him senile." "The family," said Eleanor, "are the least of my problems. Julian will bluster and Petra will seethe and their case will fail, because Sir Rowland made sure it would fail. I'm not worried about the Ashworths." She set down her cup. "I'm worried about Marcus Callow, and about whoever Marcus Callow answers to." "You think Callow is the one robbing the company?" "I think Callow is a hand," Eleanor said. "I don't yet think he's the head. The head is cleverer than Callow. The head has done this before, to bigger companies than this one, and never once been touched." She looked at Hargreave levelly. "The head is the man who destroyed me in 2003. I'm almost certain of it. And if I'm right, then the moment he realizes Eleanor Vaughan is not only alive but sitting on top of the very company he's currently draining." "He'll do to you what he did before," Hargreave finished quietly. "He'll manufacture a reason I'm unfit, Instability, incompetence, a scandal, it's what he does. He doesn't kill people, Mr. Hargreave. He's far too careful for that. He makes them unbelievable. He turns them into whispers. She allowed herself a thin smile. The trouble he's going to have this time is that I know the trick. You can only make a person into a whisper once. After that, they know to write everything down. The provisional grant of probate came through in the 6th week, faster than anyone had expected, and with it Eleanor Pryce became, subject to the family's ongoing challenge, which everyone including the family's own barrister now privately expected to fail, the controlling shareholder of Ashworth Meridian Holdings. She did not move into Cadogan Gardens. She did not buy clothes. She did not hire a car. She kept sleeping in the small room over the scullery, out of a stubbornness she could not fully explain, except that she did not want to become comfortable because comfortable people got careless, and she could not afford to be careless. But she did, on the Monday of the 7th week, walk back into the glass tower on Victoria Street, and this time she did not ask to see Marcus Callow. This time she called a board meeting. There were 7 directors of Ashworth Meridian. She had studied all 7. 3 were non-executives who did little and understood less and would go whichever way the wind blew. 2 were Callow's people, installed during his tenure, loyal to him. 1 was the finance director, a nervous, careful man named Gerald Ainsworth who had been with the company for 30 years and who, Eleanor's reading of the accounts suggested, was either complicit or terrified, and she had a growing suspicion which. And the 7th was Callow himself. She had them assembled in the boardroom on the 11th floor, the one with the view of the whole gray city, and she came in wearing her navy coat and carrying a single folder, and she sat down at the head of the table where Sir Rowland had once sat, and 7 men looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'll be brief, because I know your time is valuable, and I'm still learning how a company like this works." She watched them relax fractionally, still learning. Good, let them relax. "Mr. Callow was kind enough," she went on, "to send me a summary of the last 3 years' accounts. I've read it several times. I'm afraid a great deal of it is beyond me. But I did have one small question, and I thought it easier to ask you all together than to keep bothering the finance department." She opened the folder. "There's a subsidiary, Meridian Coastal Logistics. It appears in the group structure, but I couldn't find its figures anywhere in the summary. I expect that's just my inexperience. Could someone explain to me what it does?" The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. To Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime watching men decide whether to lie, it lasted a very long time. It was Callow who answered, smooth as ever. "Coastal is a small dormant subsidiary, Mrs. Pryce, legacy of an old acquisition. It doesn't trade anymore. That's why it wouldn't appear in the operating figures. There's nothing to report." "Ah," said Eleanor, "dormant, I see. That explains it, thank you." And she closed the folder, and she saw the very small collective exhalation move around the table, and she thought, "He just lied to me in front of 6 witnesses, and I have him recording it." Because Meridian Coastal Logistics was not dormant. In the 200 pages of Sir Rowland's papers, and in the further weeks of digging Eleanor had done since, using the shareholders' right of access that the grant of probate had given her, she had established beyond any doubt that Meridian Coastal Logistics had moved, in the previous financial year alone, some £14 million, through a chain of intermediary companies, out of the group, and into the fog. A dormant company does not move £14 million. A dormant company does not do anything at all. She had not asked the question to get an answer. She had asked it to give Marcus Callow the chance to lie, on the record in front of the board, so that, when the time came, no one could claim he simply hadn't understood the figures. She had learned that lesson at the age of 29. You do not confront a professional with the truth. You let him bury himself in a small, checkable, catastrophic lie, and you keep it, and you wait. "Well," she said, rising, I shan't take up more of your time. I'm sure you're all terribly busy. I only wanted to put a face to the name." She smiled at them, mild as milk. "You've all been so patient with me. I do appreciate it." And she gathered her folder and left the boardroom. And behind her she left 7 men who had, to a greater or lesser degree, just decided that the old man's housekeeper was exactly as harmless as she appeared. Which was precisely what she wanted them to decide. Gerald Ainsworth came to Cranmore House on a Thursday evening, alone in the rain. Eleanor had expected someone to break before Callow did. Fraud is a structure held up by nerve, and there is always one person in it whose nerve is failing, and the finance director, 30 years with the company, a photograph of grandchildren on his desk, a man who had signed things he should not have signed, had the look of a man whose nerve was very nearly gone. She had in fact invited him in a way. She had let it be known, through a carefully casual remark to one of Callow's board loyalists, that she was thinking of bringing in outside accountants, proper forensic people, just to help me understand it all since I'm so hopeless with figures. She had watched the remark travel, and now here was Gerald Ainsworth on her doorstep, soaked through, twisting his hat in his hands like a man in an old film. She sat him by the kitchen fire and gave him tea and did not say anything at all, because she had learned that the guilty, given silence, will eventually fill it. "I didn't start it," he said at last. "I want you to know that I didn't start it." "I know," said Eleanor. She did not know, but it was the right thing to say. It was going on before Callow, even. It was going on when Sir Rowland was still, when he was younger, when he still came in every day. Ainsworth's hands shook around the cup. "I found it, years ago, Meridian Coastal. I found the discrepancy and I took it to—" He stopped. "To whom?" Eleanor said very gently. "I can't." "Mr. Ainsworth, you've come all this way in the rain. You didn't come to tell me nothing." He looked at her, and she saw in his face the exact expression she had once worn, 23 years ago, in a merchant bank in the city. The face of a decent person who has found something terrible and is discovering that the people above them do not want it found. "I took it to a man," Ainsworth said, in a rush now, the dam giving way. "Not Callow. Callow's just Callow does what he's told, same as me. I took it to the man who really owns Coastal. Through the shells. He's not on any board, his name's not on anything. But he owns it and he's owned it for years, and when I took him the discrepancy he didn't threaten me. That's the thing, he was kind about it. He sat me down and he explained how much everyone had to lose, me included, and how it would all come out about the things I'd already signed, and how my pension, my grandchildren. He put the cup down before he dropped it. He didn't threaten me. He never threatens anyone. He just shows you the cliff and lets you understand you're already standing on the edge of it." Eleanor sat very still. "What's his name?" she said. It was not a question. Ainsworth looked at her for a long moment. And then, because a man who has come this far in the rain has already made his decision and only needs help carrying it, he told her. And the name he gave her was the name she had trained herself, for 22 years, not to think. The chairman of the shipping conglomerate. The man who had been knighted while she was made into a whisper. The man whose elegant, patient mechanism had cost a generation of pensioners everything, and who had never once been touched, because every person who had ever come close to touching him had been turned, quietly and completely, into someone no one would believe. Sir Douglas Merrick. "I know that name," Eleanor said. Her voice did not shake, she was rather proud of that. "I knew it a long time ago." Ainsworth stared at her. "Mr. Ainsworth," she said, "I'm going to ask you to do something very difficult, and I want you to understand before you answer that I will protect you as far as it is in my power to protect you, which," she gestured vaguely at the great house around them, "is now, as it happens, considerably further than you might expect. But I will not lie to you about the risk, because a man lied to me about the risk once, by telling me there wasn't any, and it cost me my entire life." She leaned forward. "I need you to keep signing. I need you to change nothing. I need Sir Douglas and Mr. Callow to believe, right up until the last possible moment, that nothing has changed, and that I am exactly the harmless old woman they think I am. And I need you, quietly, over the coming weeks, to help me gather every document I ask for. Can you do that?" Ainsworth was quiet for a long time. The fire ticked. The rain ran down the black windows. "He destroyed a woman once," Ainsworth said suddenly. "Merrick, years ago, before he came here. I heard him mention it. He was drunk. It was the only time I ever saw him drunk. He talked about an accountant, a young woman who'd got too close to something, and how they'd managed her. He laughed about it. He said the beauty of it was that she'd done all the work of ruining herself. They'd only had to give her a nudge." Ainsworth's face was pale. "It was the ugliest thing I ever heard a man say. I've thought about her, that woman, over the years, whoever she was. I've wondered what became of her." Eleanor Pryce looked at the fire. "She became a housekeeper," she said quietly. "And then she inherited a great deal of money. And now she's sitting across from you asking for your help." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the house. "You," said Gerald Ainsworth. "Me." He began, very quietly, to cry, the tears of a decent, weak, frightened man who has just been given, unexpectedly, a chance to become brave. And Eleanor Pryce got up and refilled his tea, because there are moments when the only ministry available to us is a warm cup in cold hands, and she had spent 22 years learning to provide exactly that. "We're going to be all right, Mr. Ainsworth," she said. "Both of us, I promise you. But you're going to have to trust me, and you're going to have to be braver than you've ever been. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, and then, wiping his face steadier, "Yes, I can." The family's legal challenge collapsed in the 10th week, exactly as Sir Rowland had engineered it to. The medical evidence was unassailable. The two independent physicians testified, in careful measured terms, that Sir Rowland Ashworth had been of entirely sound mind. The solicitor who had drafted the will testified that Sir Rowland had explained his reasoning at length and had specifically anticipated the challenge. And the letter, Sir Rowland had left a second letter, lodged with Hargreave, to be read only if the will were contested, was produced, and it was so lucid and so devastating in its assessment of each of his children's characters that Julian's own barrister was heard to murmur that it was the single most competent piece of estate planning he had encountered in 30 years at the bar. Petra wept in the corridor, though it was rage and not grief. Julian said something to Eleanor that was actionable, and she noted it, calmly, in the small book she now carried everywhere. Dominic, the youngest, did the one surprising thing any of them did in the whole affair. He came to her afterward in the marble lobby of the court, and he said, quietly, so his siblings could not hear, "He was right about all of us, wasn't he, in the letter?" "I don't know what was in the letter," Eleanor said, which was almost true. "I do. Hargreave read us our bits." Dominic gave a small, bleak laugh. "Mine said I'd do whatever the last person to speak to me suggested. He wasn't wrong. I've never once in my life had a thought that was properly my own." He looked at her. "Are you actually going to run it, the company, or sell it?" Eleanor considered him. There was something in Dominic Ashworth, some faint, unhardened thing his father had perhaps despaired of, but which was not, she thought, nothing. "I'm going to save it," she said. "It's being robbed, Dominic. It has been for years. Your father knew and couldn't prove it, and it broke his heart. That's the real reason he left it to me." Dominic stared at her. "Robbed by whom?" "By a man I'm not ready to name yet." She studied him. "Your father thought you'd do whatever the last person to speak to you suggested, so I'm going to be careful to be the last person who speaks to you before you leave this building. Go home, Dominic. Speak to no one about this. And if you meant what you just said, if you'd like, for once in your life, to be on the right side of something, then stay quiet, stay clear, and when the time comes I may ask you for one thing. Will you do that?" "What thing?" "I don't know yet, but it will be the right thing. I can promise you that much." And Dominic Ashworth, who had spent 40 years being led by the wrong people, looked at the small gray woman who had inherited his family's fortune, and nodded, and did as she asked. It was, he would reflect much later, the first genuinely independent decision of his adult life, to trust the one person everyone else in his family despised. He had chosen correctly. It would take him some time to understand how correctly. Sir Douglas Merrick made his move in the 12th week, and it came, as Eleanor had known it would, dressed as kindness. She received first an invitation, a charity gala, the Merrick Foundation's annual dinner at a grand hotel in Bath, in aid of maritime widows and orphans, a cause Sir Douglas had funded for 2 decades and which had done a great deal of genuine good, because the truly dangerous ones always do a great deal of genuine good. It is the good that makes the whisper of their name unthinkable. The invitation was handwritten. It welcomed Mrs. Pryce to the world of business philanthropy and expressed the hope that, as a fellow steward of a great West Country enterprise, she might allow Sir Douglas the pleasure of her acquaintance. He knew that was the message inside the message. He knew who owned Ashworth Meridian now, and he was extending, with exquisite courtesy, an invitation to the woman he did not yet realize was Eleanor Vaughan, or did he? Did he know? She could not tell. That was the terror and the genius of the man. You could never tell how much he knew. She went. She wore, for the first time in 22 years, a proper evening dress, dark green, plain, bought quietly and altered to fit, and she pinned up her gray hair, and she looked in the long mirror at Cranmore and saw, faintly, under the years, the ghost of the young woman who had walked into a merchant bank at 22 afraid of nothing. "Hello," she said to the ghost, "it's been a while. I'm going to need you tonight." Sir Douglas Merrick was 73 years old, and he was one of the most charming men Eleanor had ever been in a room with, and she had known he would be, because charm was his instrument as numbers were hers. He was tall and silver and warm, and he took her hand in both of his, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the kindest, most attentive eyes in the world, and behind them was absolutely nothing at all. A well-lit empty house. "Mrs. Pryce," he said, "how wonderful! You must forgive an old man's curiosity. The whole county is talking about you, you know. The devoted servant who won her master's heart. It's terribly romantic." "It isn't romantic at all, I'm afraid," Eleanor said pleasantly. "It's rather dull. I ran his house for 22 years and he trusted me. That's the whole of it." "Trust," Sir Douglas smiled, "the rarest currency, and now you find yourself steward of a great company. It must be daunting." "Terribly," Eleanor agreed. "I understand almost none of it. I keep meaning to sell and be done, and everyone keeps telling me not to be hasty." She let a note of helpless fluster into her voice and watched him drink it in and thought, "There, that's what you want to hear. A frightened woman out of her depth thinking of selling. You can work with that. You've worked with that 100 times. "Very wise," said Sir Douglas warmly, "not to be hasty. A company like Meridian is a delicate thing. It would be a tragedy to see it fall into the wrong hands." He patted her arm. "If ever you did wish to explore an orderly sale to a safe pair of hands, someone who understood the business, someone who cared about the people in it, I do hope you'd think of an old admirer of Rowland's. I always thought the world of him. It broke my heart when he grew so confused toward the end. All those wild ideas about the company being in trouble." He shook his head sadly. "The mind, it's a cruel thing what age does. I do hope, my dear, that you won't let his more fanciful notions trouble you. He wasn't himself at the end. We must remember the man he was, not the shadows that crept in." And there it was, laid down so gently she might almost have missed it. The seed. The old man was confused. His notions were fanciful. Don't let the shadows trouble you. He was preemptively discrediting Sir Rowland's suspicions, and if she ever voiced them, by planting, tonight, in a room full of witnesses, the story that any concern about the company was merely the sad residue of an old man's failing mind. It was beautiful work. It was precisely the same move he had made against her 23 years ago. She's unstable. She's making wild accusations. It's very sad. He had done it so many times that he had stopped inventing new methods. He had a mechanism, and the mechanism worked. And why would a man abandon a mechanism that worked? Eleanor looked up into the kind, empty eyes of Sir Douglas Merrick, and she made her decision. She would not be careful tonight. She had been careful for 22 years. She would allow herself just once, one small pleasure, not enough to warn him but enough to remember. "How kind of you to worry about me," she said. "I'm sure you're quite right about poor Sir Rowland, though it's strange, isn't it?" She smiled up at him, mild as milk. "How often the people who tell us not to trust our own eyes turn out to have something they'd rather we didn't see. I read that somewhere once, years ago, in another life really." She patted his arm exactly as he had patted hers. "But I'm sure that's not the case here. Do enjoy your evening, Sir Douglas. It's such a good cause." And she moved away into the crowd, and she did not look back, but she could feel. She was almost certain she could feel the very small stillness in the space where he stood. The stillness of a professional who has heard, in a harmless old woman's pleasantry, one word too many. Another life. Trust our own eyes. Something they'd rather we didn't see. She should not have said it. She knew she should not have said it, even as she said it. It was vanity, and vanity was how professionals got caught. But she was 54 years old, and she had been a whisper for 22 years, and she had wanted, just once, just for a single sentence, to stand in front of the man who had erased her and let him feel, without understanding why, the faintest cold breath of the reckoning that was coming. She got into the hired car she had, for this one night, allowed herself, and she rode back through the dark toward Cranmore, and she thought, now he'll start looking. Now he'll pull the thread of Mrs. Pryce, the way I'm pulling the thread of Meridian Coastal, and one of us is going to reach the end of our thread first. It was a race now. She had turned it into a race out of pride. She would have to be very, very fast. She was fast. Over the following 3 weeks, with Gerald Ainsworth feeding her documents from the inside and Mr. Hargreave lending the quiet weight of the law, and a forensic accountant named Priya Chandra, the one person from her old life who had never believed the whisper, whom she had finally, after 22 years, dared to telephone, Eleanor Pryce assembled the case that she had tried and failed to assemble at 29. Except that this time she was not a lone junior analyst with a file that could be made to disappear. This time she owned the company. This time the documents were hers by right, the auditors answered to her, the board could be compelled, and every single thing she found was witnessed, copied, notarized, and lodged in 3 separate places, because she had learned, God, how she had learned, that a truth that exists in only one copy is not a truth at all. It is merely a thing waiting to be made to vanish. The mechanism came apart in her hands like a watch she had been trained to build. Meridian Coastal Logistics, the dormant company that moved £14 million a year, fed a chain of intermediaries in the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, and at the far end, a single beneficial owner concealed behind 3 nominee structures whose true controller, once Priya cracked the last of the nominees, was, unmistakably, provably, in black and white, Sir Douglas Merrick. And the mechanism inside Ashworth Meridian was not the only one. That was the thing that made Eleanor's hands go still and cold when she finally saw the full shape of it. The same architecture, the same signature, the same 3-jurisdiction fog, ran through 4 other companies, 2 of which she recognized, with a lurch, as firms whose collapses over the past decade had ruined ordinary people and been written off in the press as bad luck or bad management. Merrick had a mechanism, and he had been running it patiently for a quarter of a century, moving it from host to host like something that lived in the walls of the British economy. And Sir Rowland Ashworth had been the first man in 25 years to feel the draft and refuse to be told he was imagining it. He had not been able to prove it, but he had been able to do one better than prove it. He had been able to reach out, from beyond the grave, and hand the whole thing to the one person in the country who both knew how to prove it and had a 22-year-old reason never to stop until it was proved. Eleanor sat with the completed case in front of her, box files, now ranks of them, in the ballroom where the paper had first been laid out on the parquet, and she understood that she was holding the end of the thread. Pull it, and Sir Douglas Merrick would come out of the wall at last, into the light, in front of everyone. The question was only how to pull it, and when. Because she would get exactly one chance, and if she moved too soon or in the wrong forum, the mechanism would engage. The whisper, the wild accusations, the sad confused woman, and she would be turned, once again, into someone no one would believe. He had done it to her once with the full weight of the city behind him. He would find it easier the second time, because now she really was, on paper, an eccentric old housekeeper who had inherited a fortune, and any accusation she made against a knighted philanthropist would look, to the casual eye, exactly like the mad grievance of a woman who had risen too far too fast. She needed a forum he could not control, a room he could not empty, an audience that could not be unwitnessed. She sat in the ballroom among the box files in the cold gold light, and she began, slowly, to smile. Because there was such a room, there was such an audience, and the beautiful, perfect, poetic thing about it was that Sir Douglas Merrick himself had invited her to it. The Merrick Foundation held its annual dinner every year, and every year at that dinner, before 300 of the great and good of the West Country, bankers, journalists, judges, the Lord Lieutenant, the press, Sir Douglas Merrick stood up and gave a speech about stewardship and trust, and the sacred duty of those to whom great enterprises are entrusted. This year's dinner was in 9 days. Eleanor Pryce, who had for 22 years been so thoroughly beneath notice that people discussed their secrets in front of her as though she were furniture, picked up her small notebook and began, in her neat, clear hand, to plan exactly what she was going to do in that room, in front of those 300 people, with those box files, and the man who had spent a quarter of a century believing that no one was ever really watching. She was watching, she had always been watching. That was the one thing none of them had ever understood. She spent the 9 days preparing the way a general prepares a battlefield, which is to say, she spent most of them making certain of things that would never be seen. Because the showdown itself would take 4 minutes, she had timed it. But the 4 minutes would only work if everything beneath them was already true and already unbreakable. And so Eleanor Pryce spent 9 days making the ground beneath those 4 minutes into stone. She lodged the complete evidentiary file, every document, every trace, every notarized copy, with the Serious Fraud Office formally through Mr. Hargreave 8 days before the gala, not as a rumor, not as a tip, as a structured, indexed, forensically watertight referral of the kind she had been trained to build a quarter of a century earlier, before anyone had decided she was unstable. She had a receipt. She had a case reference. She had this time made herself impossible to unsay. She retained Priya Chandra formally, and a second forensic firm besides, so that no one could ever again claim the work was the product of a single unreliable mind. She secured Gerald Ainsworth, not merely his testimony. She secured him personally, the way Sir Rowland had secured her. She made him safe. She had Hargreave draft the protections, immunities where they could be sought, a settled financial future regardless of outcome, so that the frightened man who had come to her in the rain would never have to choose between doing right and protecting his grandchildren. She had learned that you cannot ask a person to be brave while they are standing on a cliff. You must first quietly build them a floor. She spoke to Dominic Ashworth once more, and she asked him for the one thing she had promised she would ask. And she prepared the room. Because here was the thing about the Merrick Foundation Gala that Sir Douglas, in a quarter century of using it as a stage for his own reputation, had never once had cause to consider. The guest list was not, in fact, controlled by Sir Douglas. It was controlled by the Foundation's Events Committee. And on that committee, as it happened, sat a woman named Frances Okonkwo, an investigative journalist for a national paper, who had been quietly trying to nail Sir Douglas Merrick for 11 years, who had lost a source and very nearly her job doing it, and who, when a certain Mrs. Pryce requested a private meeting through a certain Mr. Hargreave and laid a certain SFO case reference on the table, had gone very still, and then very bright-eyed, and had said, in a voice not entirely steady, "How many press seats would you like at the dinner, Mrs. Pryce?" "As many," said Eleanor, "as you can arrange without anyone asking why." The dinner was held in the great ballroom of the Assembly Rooms in Bath, under chandeliers. And it was exactly as grand and as self-congratulatory as such things always are. 300 of the region's most consequential people ate poached salmon and drank good wine, and told one another that they were doing good in the world. And at the top table sat Sir Douglas Merrick, silver and warm and gracious, receiving the deference of the room the way a stone receives rain. Eleanor Pryce sat at a table near the back in her dark green dress, and ate very little and watched. She had refused a better table. She had wanted this one. From here she could see the whole room, and the whole room could, when the moment came, see her. And there is a particular power in rising from the back of a room that no one seated at the front can ever command. Beside her sat Dominic Ashworth, pale and quiet. 2 tables over sat Francis Okonkwo, and scattered with careful casualness through the room, 7 other journalists, none of whom knew precisely what was coming, but all of whom had been told by a colleague they trusted that it would be worth their evening. Near the door stood 2 people in unremarkable dark clothes who were not, whatever their name badges said, catering staff, and who had a warrant in a folder and had agreed, at the request of the Serious Fraud Office, to wait for a signal. At 9:30, Sir Douglas Merrick rose to give his speech. He was very good, Eleanor gave him that. He spoke without notes about the sea, and about the widows and orphans of men lost to it, and about the duty of the fortunate to the unfortunate, and about, here he warmed to his theme, here his eyes swept the room with their kind and empty attention, about stewardship, about how the truly great enterprises of the world are held in trust, not owned, about how those to whom much is given must guard it faithfully for those who come after, about trust as the rarest currency, the sacred thing, the foundation of all. "For what," said Sir Douglas Merrick to 300 rapt and admiring faces, "is a man if he cannot be trusted? What is any of us if we betray the faith placed in us? I have tried in my small way across a long life to be a faithful steward. I ask no more than that it be said of me at the end, he could be trusted." And he raised his glass, and the room began to rise with him, 300 people lifting 300 glasses to the faithful steward. And Eleanor Pryce stood up. She stood up alone at the back of the room, a small gray woman in a plain green dress, and she did not raise her glass. And in the confusion of 300 people half risen, the wrongness of one person standing still and silent rippled outward until the toast faltered and died, and the room turned by degrees to look at what Sir Douglas Merrick was looking at. "Forgive me," said Eleanor. Her voice was not loud. She had learned long ago that you do not need to be loud in a room that has gone quiet to hear you. "Forgive me for interrupting. But Sir Douglas has raised a question, and I find I should like to answer it." He asked, "What is a man if he cannot be trusted?" She looked down the length of the room, past the tables and the candles and the poached salmon, to the silver man frozen at the top table with his glass still half raised. "I know the answer to that question, Sir Douglas. I've known it for 23 years. I've known it since you taught it to me personally." The silence in the room changed its quality. It became the silence of 300 people who have realized, all at once, that they are about to witness something. "My name," said Eleanor Pryce, "is not Mrs. Pryce, or it is. I made it mine and I'll keep it, but it isn't the name I was born to. I was born Eleanor Vaughan. Some of the older people in this room may remember the name, though you were told to remember it in a particular way. You were told there was a young forensic accountant at the turn of the century who made wild and unfounded accusations, who was unstable, who had some sort of breakdown and was quietly let go. She let that settle. That woman was me, and there was no breakdown. There were no wild accusations. There was a young woman who found in the books of a shipping company a mechanism, patient, elegant, nearly invisible, by which the pension savings of thousands of ordinary people were being bled away into private hands. I documented it. I took it to the people I was supposed to trust. And within a month I was made into a whisper. My career was destroyed, and every copy of my evidence had vanished, and the man at the top of that mechanism was never touched at all. She had not looked away from Sir Douglas once. He was never touched, she said, because he was very, very good at a single trick. His trick was that he never confronted the people who found him. He never threatened them. He simply made them unbelievable. He turned the ones who saw him clearly into people no one would believe had seen anything at all. And it worked. It worked for 25 years. It worked because he only ever did it to people who were alone and junior and frightened and could be made to disappear. Now at last she smiled, a small, terrible, gentle smile. He made one mistake, she said. This year he ran his mechanism through a company owned by an old man named Roland Ashworth. And Roland Ashworth felt the draft, the way you feel a crack in an old house, and he couldn't prove it and it broke his heart. And so instead of trying to prove it himself, he left his entire fortune, his whole company, everything, to his housekeeper. Because his housekeeper, Sir Douglas, was the forensic accountant you destroyed in 2003. And this time she wasn't alone. This time she wasn't junior. This time she owned the company. And this time, her voice did not rise, but something entered it that made the room hold its breath. This time she made copies. She lifted her hand, a small, unhurried gesture, and Mr. Hargreave, from a table near the front, rose and sat upon the top table, directly in front of Sir Douglas Merrick. A single bound document, and Francis Okonkwo's pen was already moving, and 7 other journalists were leaning forward, and the 2 people by the door who were not catering staff had begun, quietly, to walk. "That is a copy of a referral," Eleanor said, "lodged with the Serious Fraud Office 8 days ago. It traces £14 million a year out of Ashworth Meridian, through Meridian Coastal Logistics, through a chain of nominee structures to a single beneficial owner. You. It traces the identical mechanism through 4 other companies over 25 years. And it does something my file in 2003 could never do, Sir Douglas, because in 2003 I was one frightened woman with one copy of the truth." She looked at him steadily. "It exists in more places than you can reach. You cannot make this one vanish. You cannot make me vanish. I've already told 300 people and 8 journalists exactly who I am. You spent a quarter of a century relying on the fact that no one was really watching." Her voice dropped almost to gentleness. "I was watching, Douglas. I was always watching. You just never once thought to look at the help." The room did not erupt. That was the strange thing, the thing Eleanor would remember. There was no gasp, no uproar. There was a silence so complete and so heavy that she could hear the candles. 300 people sat entirely still, watching a thing come apart that they had all, in their comfortable way, agreed for years to believe was solid. And Sir Douglas Merrick, to his final and lasting discredit, did the one thing that removed any last doubt from any mind in that room. He ran. He did not stand and deny it. He did not summon his lawyers or his charm or his kind, empty eyes. A guilty man's body knows before his mind does, and the body of Sir Douglas Merrick pushed back its chair and turned toward the side door in a movement that 300 people watched and 8 journalists photographed, and 2 officers of the Serious Fraud Office had positioned themselves precisely to meet. He got perhaps 4 steps, and then the reckoning that Eleanor Vaughan had carried for 23 years, folded small and cold in the deepest compartment of herself, arrived at last, in a quiet room in Bath, in the form of 2 people in dark clothes and a folder with a warrant in it, and the faithful steward was led out of his own gala through his own admiring guests, and not one hand in that whole gilded room rose to help him. Eleanor Pryce sat back down. She found that her legs did not entirely wish to hold her, now that it was over, And so she sat down in the green dress at the table at the back. And beside her Dominic Ashworth reached over and, without a word, gripped her hand hard, the way a person grips the hand of someone who has just done a thing they will never forget having seen. That, Dominic said, very quietly, was the bravest thing I have ever watched anyone do. No, said Eleanor. Her voice was steady, though her hand in his was not. The bravest thing was staying alive for 22 years, cleaning other people's houses, when everything in me wanted to disappear entirely. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since 2003. This part was easy, Dominic. This part I'd been rehearsing for a very long time. It did not all resolve that night, of course. Real things never do. The mechanism of the law is slower and grubbier than the mechanism of a speech, and it took 18 months in the end for the case against Sir Douglas Merrick to move through the courts. But it moved. That was the difference. In 2003 there had been nothing to move, only a whisper and a vanished file. This time there were box files and forensic experts and a finance director who had found his courage, and a referral that existed, as Eleanor had promised, in more places than any one man could reach. The mechanism that had lived in the walls of the British economy for 25 years was, at last, dragged out into the light. And once it was in the light, others came forward. It turned out Eleanor Vaughan had not been the only one Merrick had turned into a whisper over the years. There had been a man in 2009, a woman in 2014, and when they read in the papers what a housekeeper in Bath had done, they came out of their own long silences, one after another, and added their voices to hers, until the whisper became a chorus, and a chorus cannot be unsaid. Sir Douglas Merrick was stripped of his knighthood. He was convicted, at the age of 75, on multiple counts of fraud spanning 2 decades. He would die some years later in circumstances considerably less gilded than the ones he had spent his life arranging, and Eleanor did not go to hear the verdict read, and did not go to any of it, because she had discovered a thing that surprised her. Once the truth existed safely outside herself, in more places than could be reached, she no longer needed to watch it. She had carried it alone for so long. It was enough now to set it down and let other hands hold it up. What she did instead over those 18 months was quieter and harder and mattered more. She had inherited, the newspapers kept reminding everyone, some £340 million. And the question the whole county could not stop asking. Frances Okonkwo asked it directly, in the long profile she wrote, the one that finally made Eleanor Vaughan's name mean the true thing instead of the whisper, was, what would the housekeeper do with the money? The answer took Eleanor a long time to arrive at, and she arrived at it in the end, in the small room over the scullery, where she still slept, because she had discovered she did not want to stop. The pensioners came first. The ones from 2002 from the shipping company, the nurses and bus drivers and retired teachers, like her own mother, whose savings had vanished into Merrick's elegant patient mechanism a fraction of a percent at a time, and who had been told all those years ago that it was simply bad luck, that no one was to blame, that there was no one to sue and nothing to recover. Eleanor found them. It took months and a great deal of money, and Priya Chandra's forensic skill turned now toward reconstruction rather than accusation, finding the people, tracing what each had lost, calculating what each was owed. And then, quietly, without press, without ceremony, Eleanor Pryce began to give it back. Not charity, restitution. Each of them received, with a letter she wrote herself, an accounting of exactly what had been taken from them a quarter of a century before, and a sum that made them, in the small way that mattered at the end of a hard life, whole. She could not undo the 25 years. She could not give back the retirement spent in worry, the small dignities foregone. But she could do the one thing that Sir Douglas Merrick had spent his life making impossible. She could stand in front of the people who had been robbed and told they were imagining it, and she could say, "You were not imagining it. It was real. It was taken. And here it is, returned." There is a particular kind of justice that arrives too late to fix anything and matters enormously anyway, and Eleanor had spent 22 years wanting it for herself, and she found she could not rest until she had given it to everyone else. Merrick had done it too. Ashworth Meridian she saved, as she had told Dominic she would. She did not sell it, and she did not tear it apart. She cleaned it, removed Callow, who was charged alongside his master, kept the honest people, and made Gerald Ainsworth, the frightened man who had found his courage in her kitchen, the chairman, because she had come to believe that a reformed coward makes a better guardian than a man who was never tested, since the reformed coward knows exactly how the walls come down and watches for it forever after. Under Ainsworth, and under Eleanor's own quiet ownership, the company that Sir Rowland Ashworth had built survived, and steadied, and went on employing the 1,400 people whose livelihoods had been the last thing on Sir Douglas Merrick's mind, and very nearly the last thing on his victims' children's plates. And Dominic Ashworth she did the strangest thing with of all. The one thing she had asked him for, the promise she had extracted in the marble lobby of the court, it turned out to be this. She asked him to learn the business, not to run it at first, to learn it. To sit with Ainsworth and with the honest managers and, most of all, with Eleanor herself in the evenings, in the library at Cranmore where Sir Rowland had once handed a young housemaid a balance sheet to read, and to discover, for the first time in his led and borrowed life, what it was to understand something with his own mind and act on his own judgment. "Why me?" Dominic asked her early on. "Your father was right about me. I've never had a thought of my own. Petra hates you and Julian's trying to sue you, and I'm the only one of us you've picked to teach. Why?" Eleanor considered him across the library table, the lamp between them, the great dark house around them. "Because you're the only one of the three of you," she said, "who ever once asked why. Julian only ever asked how much. Petra only ever asked why not me. But you, that day in the lobby, you asked me who was robbing the company. You wanted to know the truth of a thing, Dominic. That's the whole beginning of everything. A man who wants to know the truth of a thing can be taught everything else." She smiled. "Your father despaired of you because he mistook a slow start for a wasted man. He was clever about almost everyone. About you, I think he was wrong, and I mean to prove him wrong if you'll let me. It's the last thing I can do for him." She would, in the years that followed, put the company into Dominic's hands, slowly, carefully, the way you put a great weight into the hands of someone you are teaching to lift. And he would not be a great man exactly. But he would be an honest one, and a watchful one, and he would run Ashworth Meridian faithfully and well, and he would understand, to the end of his life, that he owed the whole shape of himself to a housekeeper who had looked at him when everyone else had looked past him and seen, under the lead and borrowed years, one small unhardened thing worth saving. The last scene belongs, as it should, to the small room over the scullery. Eleanor Pryce sat there on the narrow bed, on an evening 2 years after the reading of the will, and the loose board was still loose, third from the window, because she had never had it fixed and never would, and she found she liked it that way now. It was where the truth had waited for her. A house should keep a place where the truth can wait. She was one of the wealthiest women in the west of England. She had restored a fortune to the robbed, saved a company for the people who depended on it, made a man of the youngest Ashworth, and dragged a monster out of the walls of the British economy into the daylight of a courtroom. Her name meant, at last, the true thing. And she still slept in the servants' room, because she had discovered that the years there had not been a burial after all. They had been a training. 22 years of being unseen had taught her the one thing that the young forensic accountant at the merchant bank had never known, that the most powerful position in any room is the one no one is watching. She had learned to be furniture, and it had nearly destroyed her, and then it had made her the only person in England who could do what she had done. The powerful had discussed their secrets in front of her for 22 years because they could not conceive that the help was listening. She had been listening. She had always been listening. On the small table by the bed sat the folded letter, the one in a dead man's hand, the one that began Eleanor and ended you were always the best of us. She had read it perhaps 100 times. She did not need to read it again. But she rested her fingers on it, in the lamplight, the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of a friend. I did it, she said to the empty room, to the old man who was not there. I found them. I took it back. Not for you. A pause, a small, tired, honest smile. Well, not only for you. Somewhere below her the great house ticked and settled. 41 rooms of it, hers, all of it, and she found that she no longer felt like a trespasser. She had earned it. Not by being loved by an old man. The county could believe that ugly thing if it liked. But by being, exactly as he had known she was, the one person he could trust not to burn it down and not to stop until the fire that others had set was finally, completely out. Eleanor Vaughn turned off the lamp. And in the dark, in the small plain room where she had hidden for 22 years and from which she had, at the very end of a long detour, walked out to finish the thing that had once destroyed her, she slept, for the first time in a very, very long time, the whole night through.